everybody. What an amazing group of people present here. It is so wonderful to see you. And we're going to try, and I've briefed the speakers, to try and be as brief as possible so that you clearly come with your questions and your comments. And so we're hoping to have a very, very vibrant conversation, because around a table you have a conversation, not a debate. And we invite you to be part of that conversation. But the issue of forgiveness is really a thorny one. It's a very difficult one. When you have been violated, when you have been hurt, then forgiveness becomes problematic. Because your intuition wants revenge. Intuitively, you want something to be done. And so what we're talking about is actually counterintuitive. And I suppose that's what makes it so fascinating. We're going to start with Dr. Willem Verwoerd, and he will be followed by Sisonke, and then Dr. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela.
I'm going to speak from the point of view that I'm rooted in, which is coming from a white, middle-class, Afrikaner, Dutch Reformed Church, Verwoerd background. I think if I speak from that point of view, you can see that it would clearly not be appropriate for me to start by saying much about whether it is the time for people to forgive. I don't think it's my place, or people coming from my point of view, to answer that question. But I think there might be another question, and it's a question that has been, for me, generated by this discussion around parole for Eugene de Kock. And it's something for me about an experience that I've also had during the TRC, which has been affirmed in a sad way since then. And that, I think, has to do with the fact that I think it's time perhaps for many people to begin to even think about asking for forgiveness. So instead of speaking from the point of view of people who've been on the receiving end, I think I want to speak about people who've been on the responsible side in a complex way in our conflict. And I want to start with an experience I had during the TRC, where I had a chance to meet Eugene de Kock. And I wanted to meet him because I was fascinated by this whole thing around him being described as prime evil. And so what I found myself, and this wasn't sort of thought through, it wasn't something I planned in advance, but when I walked into that room to meet him, and obviously I was a bit cautious with all the blood on his hands, but there was a part of me who wanted to, when I shook his hand, wanted to say to him, I am sorry for the way you are being treated. So in a sense, there was a part of me that wanted to ask him for forgiveness, because I felt that there was something deeply wrong about the way in which my community, and including myself, and the churches, and the cultural organizations, all these different people who he served, and who he believed he was serving, were not actually taking shared responsibility. So even at that time, I felt he should have received amnesty. That it wasn't right that somebody who especially somebody who was willing to come up with detailed truth, especially somebody who was willing to show some willingness to engage with people who suffered at his hands, and in my second conversation was also willing to take some responsibility for doing something about it, because that was my second question to him when I got another chance to meet him is, tell me a bit more about what you would do if you were to come out of prison. Are you willing to do something in addition to your willingness to meet with the victims of the people who you violated? And he talked at that point even, and this is in the mid-90s, about his willingness to get involved in demining, and he had lots of ideas about what he felt he wanted to do to make up to some degree for what he was involved in. And I know since then he's been on a real journey, and partly because of the very powerful and important relationship with Pumla, in terms of his own humanization. And that's really what I want to just stop and talk and reflect a little bit on, and just make, I suppose, 2 points. Because to me, the reason why I felt I had to say sorry to him was because I felt there was a lack of shared responsibility being taken by people from within, especially the Afrikaner community. But I've been around the country quite a bit in the last 18 months or so and spoken to many people. And one of the strong themes coming out is this hunger for acknowledgement, a need for, especially white South Africans, beneficiaries, people in positions of privilege, to actually take some sense of creative shared responsibility. So the question I then obviously sit with is, why do people find it so difficult? Why do I find it sometimes so difficult to accept shared responsibility, especially when you deal with grievous wrongdoing? And you talked about the scale of the apartheid system. You talk about a crime against humanity. So what does it mean to really enter into that space, to walk towards this idea of accepting shared responsibility in a creative way? And it seems to me one of the big problems is that we tend to legalize responsibility. So when we think about it, we say, okay, within the legal system, you're responsible if you caused something and if you intended to cause something. And we individualize it often in that way. So if you say, somebody like Eugene de Kock, okay, he needs to take responsibility for what he did, what does it mean for me as a former supporter of that system, as an Afrikaner, as a National Party member, as a whatever, I can go on with that list. What does it mean for me to take shared responsibility? I didn't cause what he did. I didn't intend necessarily what he did. Then I think the thing that we tend to underestimate is the first part of that word, and that is the response in responsibility. And it seems to me, if you look at just the basic human phenomenon where somebody might cause somebody to be hurt, but the people who observe it, or the people who are present, depending on their response, they will either add insult to the injury, or they will actually help to heal some of that wound. And people talk about second wounding. And I'm fascinated by that notion that by my response, even if I was not causally responsible in the narrow sense of the word, or even if I didn't intend somebody to be grievously hurt, when I'm becoming aware of it, when I'm faced with the reality of another human being in pain, and I become indifferent, if I'm silent, if I ignore it, if I do not respond, it doesn't become a neutral interaction. I'm actually adding salt to the injury. I'm actually becoming responsible for second wounding. And I think that applies even to the younger generation today. It becomes more difficult as you remove yourself in time and space. But I think that notion of the significance of the response part in responsibility, I think, opens up a space for anybody who is confronted with the realities of people still suffering as a result of what happened 20 years ago, to actually say, what is the quality of my response? And depending on that response, you actually become responsible not only for what people did in the past, but also for what you're adding to the injuries and the suffering of people today. So that's a very weighty responsibility, which is not dependent on some kind of retrospective causality or intentionality. It's actually relational. It's about a sensitivity in the moment to what you're confronted with. And we know that the legacy is still with us. And instead of focusing and avoiding that responsibility by focusing on the shortcomings of the current government or whatever, I think we need to talk more openly about what does it mean for us as beneficiaries, as previous supporters, as descendants of previous supporters of that system, and indirectly people like Eugene de Kock. What does it mean to respond with sensitivity and humility and humanity to the people who are still hungering and asking for that very basic emotional moral acknowledgement? So that's the first really important point I'd like to make in terms of the significance of what does it mean to take shared responsibility. The second point I'd like to make is the second part of that word, responsibility. And I think there's a strong cultural thing. I mean, I think the legal system influences it, but also there seems to be a cultural resistance to taking responsibility. And I think some of it has to do with the way in which we somehow see responsibility as a burden, as something to avoid, as something that's difficult and painful to take on. And it's almost like response disability. And that there is this kind of almost intuitive resistance and almost fear to engage and move into that space. And I think some of the challenge, and this is really where working with people like Pumla and many other black South Africans, where I have been deeply humbled and encouraged and liberated, as it were, in terms of my own sense of humanity, by taking responsibility, by being willing to take at least some time to be willing to listen and being willing to say, what can we do together to address these consequences? And only in small ways I've done that, but in a disproportionate way, what I've been met with was a warmth of humanity and a generosity of spirit, which is deeply humbling and deeply encouraging. And if once you've had that experience, you cannot look at responsibility with this burdened eye. It's actually the opposite. It's actually, ironically, I think the key, one of the keys to the liberation of white and Afrikaner South Africans. So what we're avoiding, in fact, is tragic. Because by entering into that space and say, yes, I was a supporter, or yes, I am a beneficiary in so many different ways. Yes, I have privileges, I have power, I have so many things I can do to take responsibility. It's not only a selfless altruistic act, it's the reality of Ubuntu really in practice, where your humanity is tied up in that relational acceptance of having to do something, to show compassion, empathy, and engage, and take responsibility. And then it becomes an ability. And that's really what the tragedy for me is about what is going on in South Africa, is that people seem to be avoiding and withdrawing and scapegoating and denying all these kind of negative responses. And if we can just find a way of transforming that, we're actually, by going into that space, our own humanity and our own liberation is tied up in that. And I don't think there's any other way, really, for us to come to a point of sustainable peace. And perhaps if more of us, and I'm talking about white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, actually go on that journey, we will be amazed by that spirit of generosity, but even a spirit of forgiveness that I've encountered as well.
For the first time, as I was preparing for this, I thought about who I have to forgive. So what's my personal story of forgiveness, right? So I'm on the black side, so we're the winners, so I get to forgive, right? So what am I forgiving for? At a very personal level, right? Not in a sort of abstract, kind of social relations, society-wide level. Who do I want forgiveness from? And what does that mean for how I live my life as a South African? What does that mean for the kind of politics of reconciliation? So the first story is about anger and how that's linked to forgiveness. And then the second story is about gratitude and how that's linked to forgiveness. And then the third one is about my son who's 3 years old. And so that's why it's a sort of in progress, right? Because a story isn't really a story until it's over. Like when it's in the middle, it's not. It's just a bunch of stuff sort of thrown together, but it's not a story yet, right? And I think in some ways that is a kind of metaphor for where we are as a country, right? We're still in progress, so we're not quite a story yet. So it's 2 and a bit stories. So the first story is about anger. So I grew up in exile. I was born in exile. I lived my whole life until Nelson Mandela was released in exile. And I remember my first trip home, you know, I came immediately. Like I just made a plan and I was here. And it was the most amazing trip on lots of different levels. I was 17. It was an amazing trip on lots of different levels. But the thing that struck me the most about that trip was meeting my cousins for the first time. Because they looked just like me. But I had never seen them before. And we sounded the same, right? Same voice. So it's this strange thing, because when you grow up in exile, you grow up with a replacement community of people who don't look anything like you. But you have all these aunts and uncles and play cousins who you love because experientially you love them. But actually nobody looks like you. And then you come home and you've got this ready-made family. And they look like you. And it's weird. It's a surreal experience. But it's a stand-in for what you missed. Right? So when you grow up in exile, you don't miss home because you never knew it. And when you come home, you really grieve what you lost. And so that was a remarkable trip for me because it was amazing and fun and joyful, but it was also incredibly angry-making. It's probably not a word, but yeah, it made me really grieve what I had lost. And so if there's something for me to think about in terms of my personal experience of South Africanness, right? It's that when somebody says to me, so where are you from? a very difficult question to answer because I don't have a street. And I don't have a particular community. I can say, oh, well, my dad is from, but I can't say that I grew up in this particular place and that I have a particular set of idiosyncratic South African memories that make me who I am, right? And there's something that was lost there that you can't get back, right? And so if there's something to be forgiven, so who do you hook that onto? Which guy do you nail for that? Right? So is that just like a general deep-seated resentment that I must harbor in my gut and sort of be generally angry? Right? So there's something that I need to forgive someone or something for. Is it enough that it's the institution of apartheid? I don't know. Right? So when I personalize it, the first story is one about anger and loss. Right? And it's my particular story, but I think in many ways it's a story that lots of people share. Not just kids who grew up in exile, but lots of South Africans who were moved around. I think it's something that we can relate to. So that's the first story. So no answers, but just a couple of questions. The second story is a story about gratitude. So I proceed to be a radical kind of late teen and into my early 20s, and I'm deeply political, and then I sort of take up this kind of bizarre mantle of hating white people, right? And I come home, and I was studying in the US, and so I come home after my first year of university, and I'm like, oh, white people this, and white people that, and my dad is like, what is this? Like, who is this kid who wasn't raised in our house in that way, right? That wasn't the language that we used, right? So I'm groping for a kind of political identity. And having grown up in exile, where actually white people they weren't a big deal. In Zambia, in Kenya, they were there, right? They were there. Some of them were our friends, some of them weren't. Just like black people. So that elevation of whiteness to this kind of obsessive status for me as a sort of late teen, early 20s was new. So my father's mirroring that back to me, saying, like, what is this about? This is a new thing that you've adopted, right? It doesn't come from us, and that's fine. But I'm just letting you know that this is a new thing, right? So I come home after university, and I immediately immerse myself into the new South Africa, and I go to the first, to lots of the TRC hearings, right? They were public, and like, this is my job. My job is to know my country. I'm home, quote unquote. And so I go to the women's hearings. There was a special set of hearings that focused on the experiences of women, and it was at the Civic Center in Joburg. And so I go there, and it was an incredible experience. And I remember the testimony of Thandi Shezi, who talked about being electrocuted in her genitals. And she talked about both the memory of that and blanking out, but also about the kind of burden of that trauma and how it played itself out in the rest of her life. And suddenly, you know, as a young person, you are incredibly self-absorbed. And suddenly, the loss of exile is so not a big deal, right? And suddenly, I'm like, huh, so there are other experiences that require far more forgiveness and far more internal fortitude than my little spoiled self is mustering right now, right? And I understand that I know that there's no hierarchy of suffering and that everyone's suffering matters. I get that, right? But actually, compared to Thandi Shezi, I had it really, really good. And that what I missed was something that I only found out when I was grown up. Very wonderful, fantastic life in exile, all things considered, right? Despite the loss. And so between this sort of sense of anger and this sense of gratitude for the things that exile brought, right? It's because I think it's dishonest to pretend as though exile didn't bring with it certain privileges. And so while I am settled in the new South Africa, and have begun to understand the lost part of exile, it's also been a really interesting journey because I'm the ultimate insider. I think what the exiled community that came back into South Africa had was access to lots of levers of power, and to pretend that that wasn't the case, I think is dishonest in a way that doesn't allow us to have a genuine conversation about, so what am I really asking forgiveness for, right? So we were on the right side of history, so we won. And that accrued a bunch of privileges for me personally and for my family and for my whole set of, the whole community. But it tempers the loss, it really does. And so that brings me now to the third half story, which is the story of people who are not privileged and who have not had access to the benefits, and for whom the structural inequalities and realities of reconciling or not reconciling are embedded on a sort of the bedrock is about economic inequality, right? And so the real question, I think, for us moving forward, so the lead into this story is about my son. So he's 3, and he's at this new school in Joburg, and we were doing something on the weekend. We were walking past somebody, and he says to me, "Mommy, did you see that cleaner?" And the way that he said cleaner made it clear to me that this child understands the difference between himself and the cleaner, and has figured out that the cleaner exists to perform functions for him, right? So there was something in the way that he said it. So cleaner is not a term that we use in our house. I wouldn't refer to someone as that cleaner. Like, so there was a whole bunch of things that, you know, as a parent you understand intuitively, this isn't coming from us, but it's part of our world, and so I need to manage this. So I could manage the semantics of it, of course, and raise him properly and be polite, but that's not the issue. The issue is that there is, for my son and for my daughter, for this next generation who don't have the immediate memories that allow them to forgive or not to forgive, for whom the questions of race are going to be fundamentally intertwined with questions of class and with their economic privileges. There's a whole set of other questions about how people get othered and how the legacies of discrimination in this country, those who really lost, not the ones who came back with benefits, not the blacks who made good, but the blacks who haven't made good and continue not to make good. What the story about forgiveness for those families where intergenerational poverty and inequality are becoming more stark. So we see in the news today that we've got the largest numbers of unemployment that we've ever had before, that the stagnation of the economy has real consequences. And to not link those two conversations about forgiveness and conciliation or reconciliation, and about privilege and the benefits for those of us who made it on top, regardless of race, understanding that those who have always been on top will always be whiter than those who weren't, right? So it's not to say that I don't have disadvantages, but it's to say that we need to hold that disadvantage and nuance it to make things more complicated than I think we often do. So the third story is about my son and the cleaner, and how we are going to deal with that question, not semantically, and not only as a family, but as a society, so that we don't have a generation of kids who believe that some people exist to do things for them.
Thank you very much. We are a group of storytellers here, so I'll also begin with a story. When I was launching my book in the US, A Human Being Died That Night, one of the places I did it was in LA at a library, the Library of LA. And it's a large library, it's like auditorium style, it sits about 450 people, and it was packed. At the end of the conversation with the chair, the moderator said, "That's it now, no more questions." But there was a woman in the audience who was very eager, you know, really anxious to ask a question. So I sort of asked the moderator to allow her to speak. So she got up, and immediately, her first words, she broke down. She says, "I read the book last night. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't sleep. I cried all night," and then she started crying. And she went on, I'm a South African, I'm an Afrikaner. I feel so ashamed about my history, having benefited from apartheid. It's a young woman, and I'm here in LA to study my master's. I wanted to escape, but now being confronted with this story, I feel so much heaviness, and she's sobbing by now, really like sobbing in between words. And so she ends by saying, I want to ask your forgiveness. Yeah, so here I am, this South African black woman on stage, and hall full of white Americans, mostly white Americans. It's in LA. And she sobs heavily, and she says, I ask you for forgiveness. And so I walk towards the end of the stage, and I extend my arm, and she walks towards me, and we embrace. The applaud in the room, you could have heard a pin drop. And I thought about it afterwards. I thought about what was this about? Not only the reaching out and us reaching out to each other, but what's the feeling in the room about? And it occurred to me that what's happening on stage between me and this woman, her name is Susan, is something that is conveyed in public, and every one of the people sitting in the audience has a story to tell about their own pain, whatever their pain is. And so the white Americans of all generations sitting in the room, the moment evokes something in them as whites in America who have not confronted their own story and their own past. And one of the things that Susan says, and this is the most important part of my story, at the end of her sobbing, she says, I want to go back home. Now I want to go back home and give back home what I failed to do when I benefited from apartheid. Now, there's skepticism, of course, you know, people come, Americans, colleagues say, what's that, you know, this melodramatic, you know, South African, Afrikaner, what's all this, and then they kind of dismiss it. But I felt that it was not flippant. I felt that it was not an act. I felt that there was something genuine about it. I'm going to say something about this and move on to the story of the question today, but I want to say something about Susan. Months later, or even a year later, at the time we had a newspaper here called This Day. I was asked to write pieces every month for This Day. So I shared this story. It was Reconciliation Day. I shared this story and its significance for other parts, you know, other countries in the world that are grappling with these issues of a terrible past that has not been confronted and dealt with. A few days later, I received an email from Susan. Susan happens to be in Pietermaritzburg. She's learning Zulu. She's preparing to go to a community in KwaZulu-Natal to work with a group of HIV AIDS project, people who are counseling and providing support and all sorts of other, you know, community building projects. And she is in Pietermaritzburg learning, doing what she said she was going to do when she was sobbing in that room. And so forgiveness and these processes of forgiveness, they can be flippant, but sometimes they can be profound. They can be about changing, transforming consciousness. And at the end of the day, these processes are really about the question, how do we transform consciousness? So these processes of forgiveness, it seems to me, really go beyond forgiveness. And this is why I am beginning to think about this word as the wrong word. That forgiveness is the wrong word. It doesn't describe what is going on. We're talking about the complexity, just holding the complexity and allowing the complexity to unfold. So forgiveness sounds like, you know, a word that concludes something. You know, it's the end, it's the chapter, it's the closure, you move on. In fact, often people speak about forgive and forget. On the contrary, I think forgiveness is actually the beginning. It's an opening up rather than a closing and a moving on. It's an opening up. It's an opening up of the space of engagement. It's that first step of, I can actually connect with you now that I've heard your pain and you've heard mine, and you are thinking about what you did to me. It opens the space for us to engage. And that's always the challenging part. That's the most challenging part, is that beginning of trusting that I can stand in front of that home, despite the fact that his father is a Verwoerd, grandfather is a Verwoerd, and his father is a Verwoerd. I can stand and trust that if I open myself up, and he does too, something is going to emerge. I call forgiveness now in my new writing the emergence of the unexpected. Because once we encounter one another, opening ourselves up to the possibilities of moral imagination, then that is what springs out of that openness. We never knew that we were going to have actual stories of forgiveness at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We knew that this is a commission of reconciliation. It's created so that people can think about the possibility of reconciling. It's not true that people are told to forgive, by the way. That's another story. Now, we didn't expect that there would be actually, and when these stories emerged, we were intrigued. We were intrigued in part because the canons of this kind of work have told us that it's impossible. The experts have told us that it can't happen. There are major canonical texts on this that have kind of, you know, continued to be the truth, that this can't happen. And yet here was a moment in our country where we got together like we are sitting now, and something happens on stage. And the woman whose husband was killed turned to the killer and says, I forgive you. And sometimes it doesn't end there. They even go as far as to say, I wish you well. And this is the thing about forgiveness, that it's a kind of compassion and caring that is about, that goes beyond the words themselves. That is about, I care for you so much that I want to begin this journey with you and make sure that actually you stay this way. And this is why forgiveness, the word forgiving, perhaps is better than forgiveness, because it's almost like it's a process, and sometimes it's not a straight line. You know, people whom I've worked with, I have interviewed, they say, there are days I wake up, especially around anniversaries, I'm angry, you know, I'm filled with this resentment because this would have been my son or my husband's, you know, birthday, or we would have been celebrating with my husband our anniversary, or now it's Christmas and he's not gonna be sitting around. So there are days when I feel angry and I feel resentful. But what restores me is the memory of that moment, of that person recognizing my pain. It sounds like something very little. People say, oh, forgiveness, you know, is symbolic and so on. Symbols are very important when people are hurt. And so when people who are forgiven say, what restores me is a return to that relational moment when this person looked in my eyes and said, I recognize the pain that I caused you. It's not going to bring the loved one back, but what it does, and this is huge, it recognizes that the perpetrator did something terrible to another human being. Remember that when these people commit their atrocities, they dehumanize the other. You are a non-human being. You do not exist as a human. You do not bleed the same way. You do not experience the pain the same way. And so this enables them to commit their atrocities. They dehumanize the other. But what is also more important, perhaps, to realize is that before that border is crossed, because you ask the question, how can, even so, they must know that this is wrong. But before the border to commit the atrocity is crossed, they have to dehumanize the self. And I think that that damage to that person who does not acknowledge the voice of conscience is the greatest tragedy in these stories. All these people who committed atrocities and those who turned a blind eye when they saw that their atrocities being committed. There's a wounding in them. It's a dehumanization of the self. And so it means that this work of forgiveness, the word, again, it's the wrong word, but this, for want of a better word, and because it is a working word, you know, this word captures really healing on multiple levels of healing, because you're healing the person who for many years no one ever said, I recognize that I've pained, I've caused you pain. And so that moment of rehumanizing you as the survivor and rehumanizing your lost loved ones, because those words also capture something about the humanity, the recognition of the humanity of the other. Our problems are problems of an absence of recognition. When I'm treated in the way that you described, I'm excluded from opportunities, you know, as a result, now I'm looking back, there are so many lost moments, lost time because of exclusion. That is because I am not recognized as a fellow human being in my country. You know, you were in exile, I was in South Africa, but I could never say I am a South African. I was only able to do that when I flew back after having voted in the United States and coming back home and feeling I am a South African. And so the pain, you know, the pain is very profound, and so that act of recognition is very important. And again, on the question of, you know, the word being wrong, when we were at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, white people were, we had a problem. White people didn't want to come. Those who came, they came and said like this, we're going to see what these people are going to say. And you could see the transformation in some of them. Really. I mean, this is why we are in this work, because we know it works in the sense of transforming the consciousness of people. When people actually understand the pain that has happened to the other, it opens them up and they are able to see what they refused to, not that they didn't see, but they were speaking from a comfort zone. What you see then during the hearings of the commission, you would see the person actually, you know, the body language would change. And sometimes people would start crying, you know, and so, some people might say, oh, it's crocodile tears, but it's emotion. It's a show of emotion. The challenge is, how do you sustain that emotion so that it's taken to another level? Now, other people, some people, you know, these people cried and other people didn't want to cry. Why? Even though they felt the emotion, but they dare not allow themselves to cry. Why? Because shame is too great. That's the other side of forgiveness or remorse. I think that this other word, remorse, is a very important word. We often talk, even in the scholarship actually, forgiveness is often debated and discussed as a word that, or as a process that happens on its own. So those who don't want to show, even though they feel the shame, they dare not embrace that shame because it makes them feel evil. That's part of the problem, to add to what you were saying earlier, Willem, that it's the fear of facing the shame. Because shame means that I am admitting that there's an evil part in what I did or did not do. So people deny the shame, and once people deny the shame, they are unable to connect to the pain of the other because they are so focused on themselves. I feel shame, I can't admit, I have to wiggle myself out of this, and they make stories and this and the other, you know, I wasn't there, or I actually didn't support apartheid, actually I never even voted, you know, and all of this kind of thing. And it's a fear, you know, it's a fear people, it's a self-protective measure. Deny the shame and deny the guilt. And yet the healing begins actually with opening up to even that shame. But here is a challenging thing for people now who are on the other side, who are the oppressed people. It's challenging, but that is, you know, we've found that this is a reality, that the openness, unfortunately, demands, in order for us to have conversations that are healing, it is necessary that for both sides, you know, the anger is important, and we ought to express the anger. And so if there is a relationship that is developing from a place of trust of the process, trust for the process, even if there is the anger, the person who did the deed or who supported the deed or did not speak out against the deed, if they're open enough, they accept and acknowledge and understand where the anger comes from, instead of saying, why are you angry at me? You know, we're supposed to be reconciled, why are you now angry? But the other side of the story is that then the anger having played its part and having, you know, kind of played out, there is a moment then of reflection on what the other person, where the other person is emotionally. And if that openness is present, then the connection and the change and transformation often unfolds. And hence this notion of the emergence of the unexpected. But all of that requires that we take the risk. It's a risk to let go, you know, of some of the intense emotions that we have. It's a risk, but you trust beyond the risk, you trust. And the trust is also about the fact that you trust that it's not going to happen again. The devastating thing about these acts of dunadering, you know, forgiving and coming together, is when things repeatedly happen. And the words then ought to be a promise that henceforth my consciousness is so transformed that I am going to be a better person. I am going to care. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to care for your kind, and so on. And just finally, this conversation is very important, because the issue of social and economic justice, we should have this conversation side by side. Some people think that we can't have the conversation about forgiving or about, you know, these processes of transforming relationships without sorting out the issue of economic justice. I think these processes should go hand in hand, because when people are not healed, when people have not had the opportunity for someone to say, we actually did something wrong, then it becomes a traumatic burden that is not worked through. We have a word in psychology that we call working through. People need to have that healing, because then it frees them to become what they were intended to become. But if this continues to be an untold story, an internal narrative that has not been worked through, it continues to be a wall that prevents the person from becoming free to engage in ways that they can, you know, if the world allows them to heal internally as well as in terms of their external environment. And so the question itself, I would say, if we're to do a yes and no, I would say we need to complicate the question so that we can consider all the nuances and the layers and layers of stuff that's going on all sides, but to keep it in the loop, to keep that question in the loop, but not to answer to that question only, but to respond to all the other issues that play around it as well. Thank you.
We are dealing with a serious problem here. And I think that as long as it's still in the hands of the liberal project, we're still going to miss the point. As long as it's still driven by liberals within the white community, we're still going to miss the problem. As long as even the notion of reconciliation is suggested by the white elite and recruit the black elites, we're still going to miss the problem. Now, when I was coming here, I sat on the garden route at 4. I looked at the black bodies going to the station from the upper middle class of the garden. When I look at these black bodies, I was trying to understand whether they could have had that there's something of this nature about them without them happening. Now, when I look at these black bodies, I ask myself, can really Mamu Pumla speak on behalf of them? You know, I'm going to ask the question nonetheless. Mr. Verwoerd, white arrogance in South Africa. How do you deal with that? White arrogance explicitly shown in UCT recently, when UCT says we no longer consider black as a proxy of admission policy, but we accept disadvantagements. White arrogance in Stellenbosch. How do you speak truth to that?
Earlier this week, SAFM, after a debate, had the question, should we have another Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I just want to hear what your thoughts are on that, given the kind of disparities that are making people go wider and wider apart.
It's very important for us sitting in this room, all of us sitting in this room, as black people, as you say, black middle class, you know, students at universities and so on. It's very important for us that we don't fall into the trap that white people who did not speak out against apartheid fell into. There is always a danger, the danger always exists, that we will have to be accountable. All of us, you know, those who can go to UCT, those of us who have jobs now, we had the door open for us, and transformation for us means that we could put our foot in the door, whether it is to get a university degree or a job at a university or some professional place. And so we have a responsibility to speak when we can. The question is not whether we are speaking on behalf of the poor necessarily. The question is that we are speaking in order to right the wrongs that we see in our society. For example, when we witness the corruption among our political leaders, when we witness monies going to political leaders' pockets instead of to the education of our youth, of the majority of black people who go to poor schools, we speak out. In a way, we are speaking truth to power, whether it is on behalf, I mean, whatever language one uses. The important thing is that we have to speak because that is the power we have, the power of voice. And that continues to be important. Kumani is raising an important question that we have touched on around this table and some of the questions from the floor. The question of what transformation for the majority of people in South Africa, the majority of black people? And the answer to that question is none. The majority of people, no matter how much you can be told that houses have been built, there's water in homes and so on, the majority of people in our country are aching and they're in pain. We see it every day. And what do we do about that? We come to these meetings, we talk about reconciliation, but we have also to have the same dialogue about what do we tell our leaders and what do we do? What's our role? What's your role, Kumani? What's my role? Your role, Kumani, as a person at UCT, and what is my role as a professor at a university? Each one of us, what's your role as a white person? What is our role? What should we do? And we should do something. What that something is another conversation, I think, as part of this dialogue that is a challenging question. I mean, these dialogues, where do they lead to? Do they lead to some statement about this is what we are demanding from our leaders? Or do we go home and we talk about how we as the middle class are going to go back to our work? I think not. I think we ought to think deeply about what is our responsibility as the middle class black, as the middle class white. What is our responsibility? And this is a first step. And so I hope, Kumani, you ask this question continuously until something shifts in terms of some statement of action by people like us who are gathered around here.
Thank you for those questions, and specifically the challenge really in terms of how do we deal with white arrogance. Now I think I can't generalize. I think it's better to answer a question like that by speaking from experience. And both the experience of my own journey beyond arrogance, but also the work that I've been involved in over the last number of years, not just here but in different places. And I think the answer has something to do with the question around should there be another Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think my answer to that would be that I don't think we need another national process in the way that the previous TRC took place. But I do think we need many, many, many similar kinds of processes at local levels. Because my experience has been that one of the few things that I think has the possibility of breaking through that arrogance and the different ways in which we've protected ourselves against the pain of the other and focusing on our own pain and our own history and blinding ourselves to what was really going on in South Africa. One of the few things that has really helped me to break through that was being exposed to the human stories of fellow black South Africans. It's deceptively simple, it's difficult to facilitate well, but when you do create that space, like Puma was saying, creating a space where the unexpected can happen, where you can have an opportunity to really hear, not just with your ears, but with your heart, what the experience has been of being a black South African under apartheid. Then there's a chance where something can actually go beyond the head and touch you at a sort of soul, heart level. And you can't walk away from that truth. I mean, you can try and resist, you can try and find for explanations, but if you actually allow yourself to hear that basic human truth about what has happened, I can't see how you can remain a human being and just cut yourself off from that. The challenge, of course, is what you do after that. And again, the language of truth and reconciliation might not be appropriate, but some kind of journey process where the exposure to the human story, to that very deep human experience, is facilitated in a space that is safe, where people can be vulnerable and leave behind some of these barriers. But what comes after that? After that comes at least spaces for difficult dialogue, where we can be honest with each other and talk about the elephants in the room and be real with each other and not just be polite and politically correct. What comes after that is finding practical ways to address the socioeconomic inequalities in our own communities, in the areas where we have some influence. That kind of journey process, I think, has the possibility, if it's happening in many different places, to begin to address some of these huge relational blockages that we still have within our society. And I do think that the operative word for me is that as a white, privileged, middle-class Afrikaner South African, there's a real need for us to be more humble. I think humility is a really important part of this process, and where we need to be willing to go into spaces and listen more and say less, and be willing to see and feel the anger, and to be willing to not become defensive so quickly. Having said that, I also think we need spaces where some of the unfinished pain from our recent past within the white community also needs to be worked through. It's not an accident that Eugene de Kock did what he did. He was a veteran of a war. There are hundreds and thousands of white South Africans out there who went through the armed conscription thing, through the armies, families, hundreds and thousands of people who have not yet had a space, I think, to really work through that. Because there is no space that I think is safe within the new South Africa to do that in a responsible way, broadly speaking. So we need spaces like that as well. And in some complex way, if we provide those spaces, I think we can make some progress. I agree with the symbol question. I do think de Kock has the potential to be symbolic, but I would be very worried about Derby-Lewis in terms of what he would represent.
So I think the question about do we need another TRC, you know, frankly, I don't think that there's anybody that I could trust with that process anymore. So, you know, Nelson Mandela is dead, you know, the king is dead, long live the king, right? And so in a sense, the kind of iconicization of Nelson Mandela speaks both to, you know, the incredible human being that he was, but speaks more importantly to the dearth of leadership that we are currently living through. So, to be honest, a TRC, if it was going to be a TRC like the one we saw before, I don't know that we have the kind of moral leadership anywhere. Private sector, you know, forget about it. Completely forget about it. You know, government, forget about it. You know, civil society, deeply compromised. You know, the liberal project, as it were. So sorry to sound cynical, but like frankly, I don't think we are there, you know, anymore. And that it was incredibly important and a profound moment. And I'm a huge fan of the TRC with all its problems. I remain kind of, idealistically enamored with the TRC, but it had its time and its place, and I think we're in a different place. And so when we have a, so I'm also impatient with a kind of response that says, oh, we need to have another conversation, and then we need to have more conversations and listen to more, white people's angst, and then, we need to sort of, think about how things have changed. And so I think that stuff is real, and I think, amongst middle-class people, there's a fun conversations to have, but frankly, the sequencing worries me a lot. The sequencing of having more conversations, which eventually get to a conversation maybe about transformation, is like, to use an impolite term, it's ass backwards, right? So it feels to me like the thing that we need to focus on is the questions where race and economic injustice remain fundamentally intertwined, and that we need to deal with those as matters of policy and law, like yesterday, and that we need to not have conversations about race that are only about the personal. And so I think part of why I got invited to this panel was because I wrote this piece where, I talked about the symbol of, Derby-Lewis, and I said, frankly, Dimpo Hani is, my role model for her rage, because she just refuses to give it up. Yeah. And in a post-Mandela era, where the notion that the narrative of forgiveness was the only, like there's this story arc, and the story arc goes, once upon a time there was this, conflicted land called South Africa, and in that conflicted land, there was never going to be peace between black and white people. This is like what I hear John Robbie saying every day. And then, he's talking about Gaza, but the only way that he understands Gaza is through the lens of us. And I'm like, yeah, let people have their own story, man, right? And let the story be more complicated, right? So then the story is, and then people came together, and a wonderful man called Nelson Mandela united them all under the rubric of forgiveness, right? And so I'm like the first person to love I love forgiveness, right? Because I can stand on a base of having a very secure home and a nice place to sleep, and lots of white people like me and I like them too, right? So that's that's easy. But what I am saying is that there is a need for a more complicated understanding that there is a place and space for people to be not just angry but enraged, outraged, right? And that the narrative of just like, let's all hug and then we forgive each other, and then with the anger first, but that the anger always comes first and then there's forgiveness, as though that like that story arc has to always be that way. And I suppose I am increasingly impatient because it's the only story arc that we've been allowed to voice. And I think 20 years later, there has to be a more complicated set of voices, which doesn't mean that people burn stuff down or that we condone anti-violence or that but that a variety of responses and a certain level of impatience has to be allowed to emerge, and that when that happens, that provides us with the potential for the kind of radical transformation that under the forgiveness trope hasn't happened yet.
I'm going to go back to the question of really how do we operationalize this at the level of society. 51 million people. Wilhelm's point of having many TRC-type localized conversations, dialogues that need to be facilitated well. Pumla's need for us to create spaces where the emergence of the unexpected can happen. I hear your skepticism about conversations, but it looks like we need to have some kind of a national approach to this problem. Because you can have your localized conversations, but that only gets you as far as that local context is concerned. But this should be a national priority, even, almost like an emergency. So I suspect the question on whether we need a new TRC, I would say not a TRC, but perhaps a permanent National Reconciliation Commission, or even department, full-blown Department of Reconciliation within the ministry, within the government, despite all the skepticisms of the leadership in the country, the skepticism of leadership in business. I think business also needs to work on these issues. IGR is not going to pull it off. Pumla is not going to pull it off at University of Free State. Neither will Wilhelm. So this needs a lot of energy. That's my
for me, I feel as if forgiveness creates a kind of space to, no offense, Mr. Favut, but kind of shift victims. You know, somebody comes to you and says, I'm looking for forgiveness. And now you have that power. You have that choice of, I'm going to forgive you or I'm not going to. And that person who's now coming to you with this truth, coming to you with this honesty, now can become the victim of, oh, she's not forgiving me. You know, the blacks in this country are not forgiving us. We're here, we're honest. You know, and it's just a perpetual shifting of victimhood, and it's not giving people a right to be angry, you know, not to forgive. I think we should also think about the fact that, you know, that forgiveness takes time. And yes, I'm as old as democracy in this country. So, you know, I'm living forgiveness and I'm kind of not living in forgiveness, you know. And I also feel enraged, and sometimes I feel that I don't have a right to be. But I think we need to think about not forgiving and giving people a right to also be angry and not shift victims. Because that's the thing in this country, to just be a victim all the time.
My question is simple. I just want to find out, how does one go about forgiving white pride? Because I feel that as much as black people have for many years hated themselves, I mean, there has been a lot of white pride amongst white people as well. And then now there's a question of forgiveness, and there are those inequalities already because somebody is coming from pride. Personally, I feel that there's white people have as much work to do on themselves as we have much work to do ourselves, and that's the only way that we can maybe work towards something along the lines of forgiveness.
Hi, my name is Claire Lester and I'm a student at UCT in Justice Transformation. And I guess the question was with the notion that asking forgiveness opens up this space where we begin a process of recognition. And I think something that's in our more recent political history, and we're approaching the 2-year anniversary in 2 weeks, I guess, the Marikana massacre. And I think people right now are still very, very much in that angry stage, you know, and that anger is being used as a source of, I guess, fuel for other political motivations, which can have almost the opposite intention for what, I guess, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission envisioned for South Africa 20 years from its inception. But then relating back to the question of whether there should be another Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then Dr. Verwoerd saying that this should be maybe a more localized thing, is that how as a nation can we deal with more recent, very, very visceral experiences of pain and trauma and abuse without the full complicity and support of the government, and in the very maybe likely situation where there may not be full support from the government, how then would be the best way to do it locally if that's kind of the last resort then?
This is New South Africa, and whatever happens now, so the kind of gang violence we see on the Cape Flats, or the kind of Marikana, and all this anger and violence that we see, gender violence, and we respond as if it just happens and everybody's surprised that this has happened, and the whole thing is just disconnected from any kind of historical reality. And so how do we create spaces for people to make those kinds of connections, and to connect with their anger, and to connect with that was at an individual level, but also at a communal level? How do we create spaces where those connections can be made, not just with apartheid, but with, I suppose, a history that goes back even longer, colonialism, slavery, that still affects our societies today? And so how do we create those spaces where those connections can be made and be engaged with?
I just wanted to say that of the 28 or so, plus counting TRCs in the world, there is none like the South African TRC. The students of law in here would know that ours was sui generis. And to that extent, there can never be another one like it. I think the IJR is doing a good job in continuing with roundtable discussions and dialogues and you name it. And I think the efforts can continue even at the local level as you wish, but you cannot have another TRC like we had before. We all have read our constitution anyway. There is no way you can use another preamble of another constitution to have another TRC, except the one that we have. And which is the one thing that distinguishes this TRC from the rest. It's not an executive order, it's actually a byproduct of our constitution. What I wanted to say here as a comment is that in the story of South Africa, we are all actors actually, and we are all carrying very heavy burdens. Unfortunately, some of us are not politically correct, and we shouldn't be. The real issue in life is how we deal with these burdens that we are carrying as individuals. We tend to be pointing fingers at other people most of the time. And I am one strong believer in transformative change and development. And that starts with me. It doesn't start with anybody out there. It really starts with me to make a significant difference in my country. I'm saying that to say to my brother on the left side that if there is anything that we say needs to be done, it must start with us as individuals. Once we start looking at government, the national plan, anything else, you won't find anything about reconciliation or dialogue in there. You will find dialogue not even on social or economic justice issues, but it will be dialogue of a different kind. Having said what I said, I'm still a passerby, but very happy that in Cape Town you can actually engage on serious issues like this. In other parts of South Africa, these issues don't come by. And that's because we tend to think we know too much, and yet we read very little, all of us. We forget that Derby-Lewis, even de Kock, have gone through the process of amnesty. Now, if anyone didn't fully disclose, which is actually an equivalent of plea bargaining, how would they get amnesty? And in essence, how do we forgive? Where do we start to forgive?
I agree that the stuff about having the tools to navigate is important. I guess I really, really like this notion about shifting victims and the kind of stuff that happens in an interpersonal engagement where someone is asking for forgiveness. especially when they're asking for forgiveness for a race, which is a heavy burden to bear when you're like one person. So I like the way that you're phrasing that. I might steal it in my next piece. You know, I think that we have to do something about this. We get muddled up, and we have to be able to figure out a way to talk about questions of race and social relations and forgiveness and the personal stuff, which is deeply important, particularly to us. I was going to say particularly to a certain generation, but I think it's important to all of us. And then we also have to figure out a way that's connected to that, but that to have a conversation about economic justice. Because I feel as though the pull towards the individual stories makes it hard to deal with the first question that I asked. What do you do in my story, when my story is about a loss that is almost intangible? Who do I hook that onto, right? And if I can't, and this is why the economic justice question is important. So mine is a proxy for that, right? And it's a much less important proxy, but it gives you a sense of what the difficulty is. The difficulty with the question of economic justice is that you're not pointing the finger at one person and asking them for forgiveness, or asking them or saying to them that it's okay. There's no an it's okay conversation about the economic justice question, and yet it is fundamentally tied to questions of race and inequality, which are our legacy. So that's the one that I find more interesting, important, complicated, and urgent. And so it's not to diminish the importance of what the TRC allowed us to talk about, but that's precisely right, CEO. That's why it was the first conversation. And 15, 17 years later, conversation and action number 2 must move us on from there. Because as I said, and I don't say this disparagingly, but Nelson Mandela is gone. And in his absence, and what he, so it doesn't mean that the things he stood for don't matter, but I'm saying that we need to deepen that and take it to a place he couldn't in his lifetime, because his job was like, you know, we need to do this rainbow thing, because that's the first order of business. But actually, there's a second order of business, and Nelson Mandela is gone. So that's the story for me.
There's an international pattern, which I've encountered also in recent work in Israel and Palestine, that the people who tend to talk about relational stuff and reconciliation tend to be the privileged. And the people who tend to focus on the structural injustices tend to be the people who are the oppressed. And I think some of this tension that we're picking up here is the same kind of pattern. And that's a real challenge to people in the white privileged community, or any privileged community for that matter. But I do want to resist a bit this opposition almost between a focus on economic justice and then the focus on, I think almost you said, the more personal. Because it seems to me these dialogues, these relational work that we have to do is linked to the political. And that some of this has to do with our collective identities, has to do, race obviously, but it's not just a personal thing. There's a relational quality to it, but in the process we are struggling to come to terms with what does it mean to be part of a cultural group, what does it mean in terms of racial identity, and so on. And those conversations will influence the way we engage with this, with the economic justice. And I think it's really the challenge to find a way to combine those in conversational processes that actually leads to action, action that leads to conversational processes that leads to further action, this ongoing journey of humanization. I mean, that's really the word that has become for me the most helpful word, not forgiveness or reconciliation, but humanization. And I think it's particularly appropriate in the context of a system which systematically dehumanized people. And I do agree that this tendency for people to move into the victim space, especially white South Africans, and I've picked this up many times, is very tempting. And that's really why when I was giving my initial input, I really said it's not appropriate for me to answer that question. I need to speak about responsibility. And even possibly it's not appropriate for us to ask forgiveness, because that puts pressure on people. What is appropriate for us is to say, I am deeply sorry. And then allow people to move into that space when they become convinced that I'm sincere. And the only way that they will become convinced that I'm sincere is if we address practical, real issues of socioeconomic inequality.
Practical example and powerful example of what we're talking about is in Worcester. I see Dion is in the room. A story of forgiveness that begins between, you know, two people. A man who bombed the ShopRite in 1996, and one of the survivors reaching out to this man, and the story of forgiving him, coming back to Worcester to be told as a story of transformation of this man, which then touches the hearts and minds of white business people in Worcester, who then reach out to begin this restitution work where they mentor young black entrepreneurs and begin working with them. And now it's become the Worcester Restitution Project. It started as a forgiveness stroke reconciliation project, and now it's a Worcester Restitution Project. So I absolutely agree that, you know, we should not separate these two, but the way that our country is now is that the poverty and depravity is so huge that it is in our faces, and it seems to be the one thing that is important for us to focus on. But I think the way towards social solidarity begins with the conversation about, do we see each other? Do we see each other as fellow human beings? And that was the beginning point by Nelson Mandela, you know, that the empathic repair. Because what was broken in our society is the capacity for empathy across racial lines. And so what's needed now is the empathic, is to repair that brokenness. And then that builds a social solidarity and allows the sense of caring for the other. So that when we witness people in Deep Kloof crying out for recognition, we don't cringe and say, oh, they're showing their bums. But rather, we extend ourselves and say, these are the voices that need to be heard. And so, like my colleagues here, I think the story of social justice, economic justice, needs to be brought back to the table. And these conversations are part of the way of doing that. There are, of course, protests that people themselves who are in need are doing it themselves. But we too, who sit in, quote unquote, these high places, we ought to raise our voices and make a contribution so that in the end, we are not, we don't seem to be the white South Africans who look the other way. We have an equal responsibility. You speak about responsibility so powerfully, Wilhelm. The responsibility rests on all of us, including black middle class, because we are beneficiaries of the new South Africa, wherever we are, whether we are at university or we have professional jobs. We are the new beneficiaries of privilege in South Africa, and we ought to face the music and take responsibility too.
The question is once again addressed to those who have been oppressed and who still suffer the intergenerational material and psychological consequences. How about balancing things and asking, is it time to stop benefiting from past wrongs by putting an end to uninterrupted inequality? And we've not solved the conundrum, but I think we did begin to address some of these important issues. And wherever there are spaces where people debate and discuss these things, I think it's important that we keep the conversation nuanced. And in that respect, I really want to thank the panelists for the wonderful way in which they brought so many different perspectives into the conversation.
I'm just going to leave you with one word that for me is resonating quite strongly from this conversation, which is creativity. When you ask people, I often ask people, what is your experience of South Africa? And they will say it's a very unequal and paradoxical place, but it's very creative. And that's what I feel is coming out here. Like, we're bringing up these questions, we're asking hard questions. I'm not sure if we've answered the question whether it's time to forgive, but we've definitely unpacked what does it even mean to forgive, and what is the process that pushes us on, and all the complexities that arise when you start asking these questions. And the fact that we're not scared as South Africans to ask these questions is proof of that bravery and also that potential creativity, the creativity that will help us to continue to move through this process.